University of Utah. Gil has done an extraordinary job of bringing in research and funding and different things, and I'm going to let him explain some of that, but some of the places that he's worked, besides being executive director of the Career Academy Support Network and as associate professor and chancellor's fellow at UC Irvine, is he spent a little time at UC Berkeley. I guess he's traveled through all the California schools almost, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, University of Southern California, San Francisco State, and also spent a little time at, actually more than just a little time at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Conchas' education has been at UC Berkeley, where he received a bachelor's degree in sociology. There couldn't be a better school to attend if you couldn't go to the University of Illinois than the University of Michigan for a master's degree in sociology and a PhD as well in sociology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. We teased him last night. It was about 3 Illinois graduates around the table at dinner, so we had to kind of ruffle them up a little bit about the competition between the schools. But I won't take any more time, but I'd like to let you hear what I'm sure is going to be an impressive presentation on his vision for ethnic studies.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Are you guys going to be all out back there? Should we become a little bit more intimate? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Fine. I always like to begin with stories. Is that okay? And if you can indulge with me for a little bit about me history. When I grew up in Ventura, California, it was pretty much segregated. And it was segregated naturally by these, what I call, at the time when you were kids, majestic mountains. So on one side was the avenue, the Ventura Avenue, which is the old industrial part of town, that actually began as a place where folks that worked in the oil rigs lived. And it was a white working class community, then evolved into a very Mexicano immigrant community. And so the story I'm going to tell is that growing up with my little brother Jesse, and Jesse's younger than I am, and we didn't have money, so we did have the hills, las montañas, as my mom would call them. So one day we went up the hills, and Jesse must have been about 7 or 8, and I'm 4 years older than Jesse, and we were looking for an adventure that day. So we climbed up the hill, and there we saw these bushes. You're welcome. We saw these bushes of these ripe raspberries. So Jesse and I sat there. We sat there for a good 20 minutes or so eating raspberries. Then the sun was coming down, and I said, Jesse, it's time to go. So I grabbed Jesse, and about 10 minutes into our foray back home, he started itching. And I lifted up his shirt. I said, Hijo, what's wrong? He said, I don't know. And I said, we didn't see any snakes or anything like that. We were getting these welts everywhere in his face. I went home. I said, Mama, look what's going on. And all night she stood up, kind of, scratching him lightly. Then I went to bed that night, and I said, why is it that we both ate the same thing, but Jesse got sick and I didn't? Lo and behold, my little brother Jesse has been in prison, and he just spent his 36th birthday behind prison walls. And I wanted to set that context because I think it's important for you to understand where I come from and why I do the kind of research I do. I'd like to read a little vignette from my new book. Now that I put that into context, folks will understand. It's called Like a Big Chingon, a real badass. Months later, Gil is in his office. he receives a collect call from Jesse. Whenever he calls, Jesse likes Gil to verbally paint pictures for him. Pictures of the outside world, of things he wants to see. Usually Gil talks about weather or trips he has taken, or news from home. Today, Jesse has a certain picture already in his mind. Jesse says, "Carnal, just do what I say." I say, "Okay, okay." He says, "This is what I want you to do. I want you to put your feet up on your desk with your computer right there, acting like a big chingon, like a real badass." "I'm doing it, Jesse." "That's right," he says, "a big chingon talking to me." And from far away over the phone line, Gil hears his little brother laugh. And for just a second, a flash of time, there are children once more, standing on the ridge again, high above the avenue above it all. So thank you for having me here at the University of Utah. I think within that context, I'd like to explain what my vision is of the program of ethnic studies and issues of social justice, education, and community empowerment in a changing society. So an overview of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about my work on comparative ethnic studies, my practice in urban contexts, communities, and schools, my experience with philanthropy, my administrative experience. It actually relates with my work in philanthropy, theory of change, and then the vision of a 21st century ethnic studies program. I engage in the sociology of urban community studies. I address the relationship between the urban environment and schools. I present a comparative ethnic analysis to explore not only between differences, but within group differences, primarily around African American youth, Vietnamese youth, and Latino youth of Mexican descent. I engage and complicate the whole notion of social capital. And I try to do more in my new book, where I ask, social capital for who, and what does it mean? I concentrate on urban school success. And with my recent work, I really push for and promote evidence-based practices and conduct practice-based research. And my work is primarily, it's mixed method, but primarily qualitative. I was trained in demography at the University of Michigan, but the kind of questions I ask don't lend itself to that type of methodology. In 2006, AARA President Laura Latson-Dillon said this: "Taken together, the historic, economic, and socio-political moral debt that we have amassed towards black, brown, yellow, and red children seems insurmountable. And attempts of addressing it seem futile. Indeed, it appears like a task for Sisyphus. But as legal scholar Derek Bell indicated, just because something is impossible does not mean it is not worth doing." And that's the kind of approach I take to my work, which led to my first book, The Color of Success, where I asked, why do some low-income high school students of color achieve success despite urban school inequality? How does the structure and culture of urban schools mediate school success? And how do low-income youth of color experience and perceive urban school success? They focused on the origins of low-income Mexican, Black, and Asian students' engagement and success in relationship to the urban high school context. The purpose was to examine how within-school processes construct success among low-income urban high school students, to show the potential acquisition and activation of social capital in urban schools. And it's important for you to know how, the notion of social capital that I engaged with then is very different, 10, 15, 10, 12 years later. and to show how the structural and cultural dimensions of the small school reform efforts matter. And this was during the time, actually this book came before Bill and Melinda Gates was putting a lot of money out in small schools, and they actually said it failed, right? Which led to, well, this is what I argued. Structural and cultural processes divided students by race and distributed opportunities among students in a way that reproduced social inequalities. Those students who perceive stronger and healthier race and ethnic relations are more engaged in school, whereas those who feel more intimidated by the racial and ethnic climate suffer. And institutional support mechanisms help students achieve success despite their critical consciousness of social inequality. And for those of you that know Abu, this counters his notion, right? Because remember, he says once students realize there's a critical consciousness, when they have a critical consciousness, they give up. These students didn't. And he didn't have that whole dimension of institutional processes within schools, which led to this book, Small Schools and Urban Youth, where I argue that school change is a multifaceted process with technical, cultural, and political dimensions. Size is not synonymous with urban school success. Structural processes as well as cultural dimensions of reform efforts matter, such as school culture, teacher belief and expectations, and interpersonal relations. And of course, there's limitations. Again, I said size is not synonymous with urban school success. Some large urban schools do a really good job. It really depends on the culture that's created. Schools serve few to students. Testing limits success. Access to some schools remain ambiguous. There's an uneven recruitment process, and there's equity and equality issues. It's difficult to replicate teacher culture. A lot of you guys do a lot of work on teachers, and that's one of the most difficult things to do. How do you replicate that good teacher, right? That's working till midnight, taking kids home, bringing them food, etc. And it's difficult to replicate school culture. And again, how do schools deal with structural inequality, with poverty, joblessness, crime, health and nutrition, and race and class segregation, which led me to the new work that I finished and that I'm currently embracing, Street Smart, School Smart, and brought me back to why I went to graduate school in sociology in the first place, to ask, why is it that some kids join gangs and others don't? Again, me history, right? Why is my little brother in prison for gangs, second-degree murder, and I'm not? What is the role of schools and community-based organizations to engage boys from the culture of the streets to the culture of the schoolyard? It provided a comparative race and ethnic analysis, and it really emphasized the black and brown boy crisis. Right? We have a stronger school to prison pipeline than we have a school to higher education pipeline. Case study methodology, longitudinal, and it concentrated on both in and out of school factors. So the contribution to this really is a contribution to the foundation of community studies. And it really synthesized two approaches that typically have not been merged: the research on gangs and the research on street socialization theory. And this book was co-authored with probably one of the most prominent gang scholars around, James Diego Vigil, who's written 7 or 8 ethnographies on gangs and on the most recent was, I think, on the projects in LA. So it examined gang youth in low-income communities, examined the role of community-based organizations in promoting success. I've been doing a lot of research lately on community-based organizations and partnerships with other entities to promote agency and empowerment for communities, in particular for immigrant communities in LA. The role of high schools in promoting success, and again, it offers a foundation to urban community ethnic studies. It complicates this whole notion of social capital, where we argue this notion of marginal social capital. And it really represents a comprehensive policy agenda that is the basis of somewhat of my vision for an ethnic studies program. So constructing success in the city. My work extends work on in-school processes to examine both in and out-of-school factors. It challenges cultural deficit models. Folks, poor people can't learn, right? And people of color can learn. Extends research on social capital theory. Extends a mixed method approach. Continues a comparative race, class, and gender perspective. And the work I'm doing now extends work to foster youth, to homeless, LGBT populations. It continues to examine community cultural wealth. What do we learn, for instance, from Latina parents? You know, when I go to community-based organizations, I see Latina immigrant women go into these community centers to learn how to speak English and therefore try to get some kind of cultural social capital so they can then help the kids in schools and be part of the agents that the middle class take for granted. It extends the dual mission of research and practice. And some research ones, they don't like to hear that, right? But I think the University of Utah is an exception. It engages in national, state, and local policy. This is what I'm doing now with CHASM. We changed the name from CHASM to CACASM. College and career instead of just career. Because when you think of a career academy, career academies, you think it's vocational, right? It's tracking kids into vocations, which it's not. So how do college and career academies mediate college and career aspirations and expectations despite urban school inequality, and how impact policy and practice? And I'm finished a new book now with David Stern, who's an economist, where we're looking at these mixed methods. We're looking at finishing case studies now of student experiences within these different academies. It promotes evidence-based practices through work-based learning, integrated curriculum, summer internships, master scheduling, etc. And we conduct practice-based research, case studies of best practices, comparative, experimental. That's what David Stern as an economist does. So we kind of bend both perspectives. Systemic district approach, and again at the local state, influencing the local state and national policy agenda. My experience in philanthropy. I spent 2 years as a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation, where my task was this. They said, Gil, we want you to lead the grant making around U.S. inequity. It's like, man, I can do a lot of harm with that, right? First year I did a lot of harm. I made some good, one here to folks know Danny and Dr. Daphne at UC Accord. And one was another one I really liked, the University of Washington on foster youth. But I try to do a different kind of grant making that they typically do. And I'll just give you a second day I was there, one of my colleagues asked me to review a PARC, which is, I don't remember PARC, something analysis review, proposal analysis review. And it was for a $3 million grant for an economist of higher education that I will not mention the name, okay? And it was to do secondary data analysis. And I almost died. I'm like, $3 million for 1 year to do secondary data analysis, quantitative. It's like, what? It's like this, you'll learn. So I quickly learned that the larger the grant, the more recognition you got. So I played the game. I tried to get good grants out. My whole focus was always on grants that would create the pipeline for the new generation of scholars doing important work in areas. And as for those that know UC Accord, they're committed to that, and they're committed to the mentorship of the new generation. I got a grant from the Mott Foundation to look at out-of-school processes in Chula Vista, California. The Spencer Foundation. We recently got an NSF, not a large one, an NSF one to start a green global, it's actually one green global academy in West Contra Costa. Okay, which has been exciting. Got this grant recently from the California Department of Ed to do 4 case studies of high-performing academies. We're still defining what high-performing is. You know. But they want it done in 6 months, and you know what I said? Sure, we can do it. Right? We got the grant from the James Irvine Foundation to implement linked learning in 4 districts in Southern California, LA Unified, Montebello, Pasadena, and Long Beach. Working with the Aspen Institute to do a 2-generation approach, a grant that does practice-based research with women and their children. And this is one that I've been cultivating for a while, is with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and helping elevate and create health academies in schools. Because if we have a shortage of people of color going into a profession, it's in the health profession. You know, as service providers, as doctors, as nurses, and the whole spectrum. My administrative experience, again, with the Gates Foundation and other work I've done for the last. I'm currently on the advisory board for Robert Wood Johnson, so I can't get the grant yet until not on the board. Right? PI and co-PI on research projects. I was a diversity and equity advisor at UC Irvine for 2 years, dealing with faculty and graduate student issues of retention, promotion, leading various searches. Again, the executive director of CASM. Currently the chair designate of the ARA Books editorial board that currently Sheree McGee Banks is. So part of that, you know, entails budget planning, grant reporting, management of teams, which can be challenging, faculty and student advising, support mentorship, student assessment of college and career readiness. We're developing a rubric right now. We're pretty clear about what college readiness means. We're not clear about what career readiness means. And campus interdisciplinary leadership experiences around Chicano studies and ethnic studies at UC Irvine. We've also worked across community contexts, across ethnic groups. And I think my work speaks for itself, that I provide a comparative ethnic focus. Working around district stakeholders, around different districts and superintendents and school boards, parent advisory boards, administration and teachers, parents, political leaders and policymakers, community-based organizations, activists and members, again, philanthropy and business, higher education, which is important. A lot of the career academies, the most successful ones, have a strong partnership with higher education and business, right? And they provide that interdisciplinary perspective within the academy itself. So what do I see as the evolving theory of change? So we have structural and cultural disparities facing under-resourced communities. Many communities have reduced educational options and low attainment, low life expectancy, especially in Black and Latino males, poor health indicators, depression, trauma, chronic disease, low rates of employment and high rates of underemployment, high rates of incarcerations through the strong school-to-prison pipeline, high incidence of crime and violence, family, community stability issues. I'm going quickly so I can get to my vision, but I'm building up to it. Okay. Unequal housing patterns and environmental racism, low levels of assets and wealth, and low levels of civic engagement. These are the things that we hear all the time, right? So what I want to do is really look at this ecology of educational opportunity to enhance community cultural well-being. So while recognizing the unique combination of disparities impacting urban populations, we focus on maximizing educational opportunities and minimizing obstacles through P220 while highlighting community cultural wealth. Through one, educational delivery and performance in and out of school, pathways to support community success, and building commitment in the public will to support youth and young adult success. And I think that's key. A lot of people don't care about brown, black, and other kids. So how do you build the public will? right? Pedagogy in the city, I call it. Inspired by Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King's commitment to social justice, I envision an ethnic studies program with both a strong community and university presence where impassioned science, I like that, impassioned science empowers communities in their quest for equality and self-determination. So what is the vision that I envision? I envision a program that produces and promotes world-class research and challenges deficit models. And I think it's key. Although we really want to reach out to communities, I think we ought to keep pushing for what they consider world-class research. We might define it differently in different contexts. Equally key is a program that trains the new 21st century college student around content and real-world skills. And I want to emphasize that. I'll talk about it later, real-world skills. A program that works to create a positive learning environment for practitioners, students, scholars, policymakers in the community. A program that strives to bridge academic research and practice through multiple approaches, including participatory action research. In some places, it's looked down upon, right? Participatory action research. And a program whose goal is to make its research findings accessible and useful to policymakers, service providers, educators, and especially the community. Do we take questions along the way, or are we waiting? If people have questions, engage. Okay. A socially engaged program. There's a lot here. A socially engaged program. So it's interdisciplinary and mixed method research projects designed to support communities in building their capacity to transform educational and youth development practices. And I think that's key. How do you do something interdisciplinary well, but also how do you do mixed method research well? Socially engaged scholarship and community involvement to support teachers, schools, and communities in Salt Lake City and other culturally rich areas. And apply practical research to strategies to address race, gender, class, immigration, sexuality, and cultural inequalities. And again, this is key. Research initiatives that link theory to effective community practices, which a lot of folks here are already doing. And research demonstrates how educators, youth workers, parents, and community members together, I think this is key. How can you bring the community in, right? To promote academic achievement within our communities. Again, I highlight this. Dr. Bernal's Adelante project. I believe you have colleagues working with you on that. And I'm going to, Dr. Daly. Is Dr. Daly here? Dr. Daly working on on-site teacher training. Right? So it's community empowerment. Really is to support teachers, schools, and community-based organizations to address the impacts of poverty, racial inequality, gender inequality, and homophobia on academic performance and youth and young adult development. To work directly with teachers, parents, youth service providers, and young people themselves to design, implement, and assess programs and strategies that transform historic-based inequalities and promote civic engagement and academic achievement. And number 3, to research ways that teachers, parents, youth workers, and community members together can engage youth in community change efforts in ways that also promote academic achievement, healthy development, and civic engagement. Is it making sense so far? So what kind of program strategies do I see? One, of course, would be this interdisciplinary research and evaluation, which is fundamental to any kind of academic unit. The other is research training and mentoring that can include scholars and practitioners and residents, right? Postdoctoral fellows, dissertation fellows. The other could be undergraduate pathways to social mobility through career internships, scholarships, summer bridge programs, school and community capacity building where we can work and emphasize to promote social and economic mobility with the communities. Another area that we ought to push for is family resource centers, where they provide education, health, career, and support. And a lot of the career academies actually have these kind of things in place. A lot of schools have the triage around health and psychological well-being. Events, publications, and materials, and research poly-practice forums.
Can I ask you a question on this last?
Yes.
Can you talk a bit of how you envision, in terms of core strategies around undergraduate education and how those might interface?
Yeah, I have a slide that's coming up.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm trying to present a broad picture and then kind of narrow it down.
No, thank you.
So right now I'm dealing with more of the academic component, the research and how to get funding for it. So some of the possible external funding, based on what I saw, the strengths folks have here already, I thought, okay, let me put on my program officer hat and say, well, what could we do that would be creative and something that could be funded as a group of academics doing this kind of socially engaged scholarship? So some funding would be to create a synthesis of existing and new research to establish an empirical and interdisciplinary record of the pressing social issues and identifying innovative interventions. I hate the word interventions if I use it. Okay? But you see, there's nothing out there like a clearinghouse, works based on interdisciplinary work. And a lot of foundations want that. They're like, well, you're proposing this, but what's out there? So if you do the scan, you can figure out, well, what are the gaps? And how do we build research projects around those gaps? Funding to build national databases for tracking our focused population and what works. We often know what doesn't work, but do we know what works? Funding to build new networks of researchers and funding existing networks. So one example would be creating a world-class research consortium to build new knowledge about our focused populations in which established stars, this is key, would help coach and mentor rising stars. Right? And it creates that pipeline, which is what I try to do with UC Accord with that grant. Create a world-class research consortium on boys and men of color. And this has been one of my key things for a while, and there's 4 major foundations doing this. And Gates, unfortunately, is not one of them, which is one of the reasons I left. So now you have California Endowment, the Aspen Institute, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation. And funding existing networks of researchers on pressing social issues. In addition, funding individual researchers to do original research when a new or existing network cannot get the answer they need. So you might have these groups of researchers doing work together, but there's also gaps that need to be filled. Funding to support community collaborations. Right now, foundations want to fund things that they know will produce outcomes. They're doing less on primary, kind of collecting primary data. And funding to support youth, family, and community development. So this is where I talk about more from the student perspective. So I envision you have a minor, you have a major, and eventually a master's degree, right? As a pipeline to what I think are the emerging kind of global economy and what we ought to be training the new generation of ethnic studies, minors, majors, and master's degree. Of course, one is in academia. I think we kind of have that pretty well, not perfect, but I think we know how to do that, right? Just summer programs, mentoring with other researchers, training them around research projects, including them as part of the research team. And education, right, is the pipeline to become teachers, and the whole different spectrum around education. Health, which I mentioned earlier. The other area that we need to engage with is in the health arena. The health is the largest area that's growing, yet we have the least folks of color within that domain. And that's the push that the Robert Wood Johnson is making. Oddly enough, around nursing, philanthropy. This has been one of my kind of like areas that I think we can stand out, where we can train and produce a pipeline of ethnic studies majors and masters that are trained to go into the field of philanthropy. Because remember, a lot of work doesn't get funded because the people who are at the table don't understand the kind of work people do. So it takes people there to understand what we're doing, and they do want to diversify. But they feel the pipeline's not there. And you heard it before, right? Oh, there's not a pipeline of PhDs. They say the same thing. We're trying to hire people in philanthropy. Well, we don't have it. So we ought to push for that. On the criminal justice system. Again, if we're losing a lot of boys and men of color to the criminal justice system, then we ought to train our populations in this area. In particular around issues of rehabilitation, right? This one. One area would be prison sustainability as a form of rehabilitation, right? How can we train our youth to go into the prison systems, right, and truly build this whole notion of sustainability? You know, prisoners recycling, gardening, etc. Urban planning in the built environment, and this is huge. Yes?
Prisons being a free market type of industry. So I'm trying to envision what do you mean by prisons?
You know, there's a whole old notion of reproduction, right? How prisons are reproducing the market economy, right? Prisons are creating a permanent hunter class. But I think we can start small. There's hope in that. And that we can, if we really believe in rehabilitation, right? How can we train folks to go into prisons and educate populations around home, right? If a prisoner feels empowered by creating something that they own, then they ultimately eat or wear. That's more rehabilitation than letting them be stuck in a cell with no human contact. So it gives them a sense of hope, of being, of belonging, of empowerment.
And I can see that concept happening when we look at state-owned prisons. But when we talk about the prison industrial complex as a profit-making institution, which we have moved towards in this nation, I don't see that in reality.
Well, I think if we push for the numbers, you know, we might have some kind of an impact, and it's going to take time. There's a professor of I think she's a biologist in Washington, in the state of Washington, and she's pushing for this kind of reform. So they're doing research around it.
So you're not saying that prison complex. Let me ask you this question. Are you saying prison complex is something that needs to be reinforced versus got a critique of the prison complex, right? And you're trying to do very similar to help provide some sort of an opportunity for inmates, most of whom are black and brown, to gain some sort of a skill when they leave the prison.
And it's both. It's both. It's both. But I think once we start getting folks in the system, we have some kind of transformative change. Because we're losing too many of our prisoners. There's no sense. I mean, if I can, my little brother, he's in prison for 26 years. You know, they have so much to contribute to society. So how do you keep them engaged? Research shows that those prisoners that are engaged with the family on a daily basis, right, are more likely to succeed when they're released. And guess what they're doing? They're taking away their cell phones because of the issue that you bring up. So there's the urban planning and the built environment, right? We have communities where there's no parks. We have communities where schools are built on toxic wastelands. So how can we push for kids to learn about this theoretically, but also engage in practice? Again, environmental poverty and racism. And the green economy is huge. We're pushing for building green academies for kids to be trained for this wave of global economic restructuring. So the skills for 21st century content and the need for 21st century content and skills, right? And we hear about this before. One is the cognitive. For the 21st century academic and technical skills that college students typically learn in core disciplines. So we have the core discipline of sociology, what we learn, who the canon is, right? And anthropology, and history. So what students learn academically. And the non-cognitive. So I'm arguing that we ought to push as well for the non-cognitive. What are those broad skills for students to negotiate life and careers, such as creativity, problem solving, collaboration, working with diversity, right? We have to work with diversity in this changing society. And communication, and they're all based on student interest. So one way that we saw it work, and you guys are doing it here, is one integrated curriculum, work-based learning, internships, service learning. Some of the classes here have a service learning component that connects what they learn in the classroom, right, with the real world of work. And project-based learning. Was that supposed to go an hour, or it went faster? I can ask questions. So what does this mean, just putting it all together? An education for a 21st century global economy. So number one, it's a vision that fully embraces social justice, education, and community empowerment with a strong affirmation and value of social and cultural diversity. A vision that elevates your existing interdisciplinary research agendas around pressing issues that promote social and economic justice for all. And a vision that produces a pipeline of ethnic studies minors, majors, and masters around 21st century content and skills to enhance the individual, community, and global well-being, and to challenge deficit models of success. And finally, a vision that includes a clearly articulated mission statement and theory of change to acquire external funding. And I think that's going to be the challenge. How do you create a coherent, clearly articulated mission of ethnic studies that is fundable, right? So the director of ethnic studies ought to be pragmatic and optimistic, okay? With the vision, the background, training, research, the role in philanthropy, the experience with external funding, role of diversity issues in higher education, executive director roles raising money, and the you, my new casa home. So I welcome questions.
Hi, I'm Lucas Alberto, and I'm faculty in ethnic studies with a joint appointment in English. And so I'm right there with you. I found your talk very compelling. This is not a field that I'm in, but it's all the evidence. It's a reason why I think most of us go into academia, right, is to make a difference in our communities. So in English, we're very much
I'm
new.
ELL, so. Was it ESL then?
We're very much new to this idea of community outreach. Not just new, it's like, what? Like, it doesn't, it's not part of the way we understand our discipline, right? We look at representations, we look at novels, we look at texts, we don't deal with
Right.
people.
Right.
So how do you make the case to a very traditional department like the English department that there is value in community outreach? How do you frame that so that is something that is important, that is valued?
First, let me say I'm making the argument to ethnic studies, right? And it's a very different domain than it is in the traditional discipline. And that's why I think it can be done in this domain. And it's going to take more for a traditional department to embrace it. But I think if it's done well in this domain, right? Done with fidelity, done with rigor, and with a lot of external funding, they will listen. Okay? But I think, again, if we're producing that kind of research, right? And if we're working with communities for change, right? The next generation are those students that are going to come through the U, take English classes, and more prepared. So again, it's not just, one can see it as like, it's not just a social justice agenda, it's an economic imperative for the nation, right? And I think a lot of folks recognize it as such, how this social justice agenda is connected with an economic agenda. But it's tough.
Let me ask the question in a different way. So how would you integrate someone who's in ethnic studies with a degree in English in a way that honors their professional tradition and finds a place for them to participate in the kind of outreach or community engaged learning that you're talking about?
Well, I think part of it is how I said the 21st century
Can you
vision.
repeat the question when you get it back?
My question is sort of turning this question around the other way. Instead of how do you convince an English department of the worthwhileness and why you should do this. So my question is the other way around. How do you find a place for someone who's trained in English to participate in that kind of community engaged learning that values and recognizes the professional expertise and formation that someone comes from English? So like, how do you recognize disciplinary differences and create a space within ethnic studies for that kind of
And I think that's the answer in itself, is that ethnic studies will be a place that embraces this interdisciplinary perspective. And most folks, you take an English department, right? Most folks that go from our communities to get an English degree, what do they eventually want to do?
Become a professor like me?
Well, I mean, if you're at the graduate level, right? But a lot of students go into English, they want to be teachers, right? So then, how can you have that service component within ethnic studies, where you can take the core academic skills that you learned in English around Shakespeare, Gloria Zaldúa, right? And apply it with the real world, kind of real world meaning of what it is to practice English in our communities. But that's always a tension. It's in academia, right? Do we publish, or do we go and help our communities? Or can we do both? Yes?
I got 3 questions. First is, how does the work of William Lewis Wilson and his work on poverty address some of the early stuff that you have in your slide, in terms of looking at roles of poverty, and then the research that came out of that realm address some of those things that you're talking about? The second one,
Can we go one by one?
I'm on a roll, man. Well, by the way, Gary Anderson said hi. The second is, how can we address issues related to how groups interact with each other at specific points in time? When you take a look at, let's say, African Americans and Puerto Ricans and then or people in different neighborhoods who are interacting with each other at the same time, and how that doesn't get talked about a lot in terms of spaces of interaction, and then also how those spaces happen in terms of public big places like a mall versus their own neighborhoods. And can you speak to something like that? The third is, how can you deal with other issues related to gender, sexuality, and other parts of the ethnic studies preparation? So for example, if a kid who's prepared in Chicano studies and let's say engineering goes to New York City, people are going to say, well, who are you, man? Are you Puerto Rican? Are you Dominican? And then he's like, wait a minute. My preparation didn't prepare me for trying to address these whole notion of diaspora around the whole Latino Chicano experience. So could you talk to some of that stuff, and then I'll follow up with the fourth question.
So first you want me to engage with Julius Wilson.
Yeah, in terms of how his seminal work on poverty and race
Well, he
sociology relates to
so
that.
Bill Wilson talked about how it was joblessness that's creating what he calls this the notion, right, that the creation of black ghetto, for instance. He said joblessness produces this notion that men don't have jobs, right, and you have this large proportion of females, right, having kids with no fathers around. So it perpetuates the cycle of poverty. So in a nutshell, he says jobs will create and will further enhance the family and will help in breaking down the whole cycle of poverty in the communities. So one of the critiques was that, well, if only you had a marriageable black male, right? But I think that in a sense, Wilson's notion of joblessness, not about creating these pathologies in black communities or Latino communities, but creating a system where we train the new generation around college and careers, gives folks a sense of belonging, right? Gives folks a sense of civic engagement. So I think the college and career movement, if you will, learns from the fact that we're not training our populations for a 21st century knowledge-based economy, that we rather outsource, right, instead of giving jobs to people here. So in a sense, the work borrows from Wilson, but I think it complicates it. For the very notions that you talk about, where this, there's complexity not only between groups, but within groups, right? And so one of the reasons I, for instance, went to the University of Michigan was to complicate what my notion of Latino was. For me, in California, it was about Chicanos, right? I went to the University of Michigan Graduate School, and I was with Cubanos, right? I was with Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, mixed race folks, and it opened up to a whole new notion of what it meant to be Latino in the United States. Puerto Ricans, those that were born on the island and those were born in the U.S. And you had a third question.
It was around how you teach about specific groups in the historical period of time that interacted with each other.
Right. A good example would be, have you heard of the work of Tomás Almaguer, Racial Fault Lines? He wrote a definitive book, a comparative book on Asian, right, on African American, and on Mexicanos in Oxford. And it was the historical origins of white supremacy from 1850 to 1900. So he was looking at the racial ordering at the time that was very much based on the class system and how that class system interacted with the racial formation at the time. So at that time period, there was the Mexicano rancheros in California who owned the land. So they were the superordinate group, right, followed by the other groups. And at the time, it was actually the Japanese and the Chinese that were at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Over 200 years later, in our current economy, we see something very different, right? How the current economic ordering and the issues of race, compounded with gender, compounded with sexuality, right, produces a different kind of racial ordering. And so that history has to be taught. We have to learn from the history. There's no way around it. Tomás Almaguer was my dissertation chair. He says, Gil, your work needs to be within context. It needs to be comparative. Otherwise, there's a so what. There's a so what element. But the history is crucial to the understanding of ethnic studies, of our histories, of the racialized histories, right? That interact with class, that interact with gender, sexuality, and in different contexts. So what happens, for instance, I met a couple of people from Texas, And the Tejano experience is very much different from the Chicano experience in California. Very much different from the Chicano experience in Michigan. I recently gave a talk at Springfield, Arkansas, where 65% of the school-age children are Latino, from El Salvador and from Mexico. In Arkansas, North Carolina. I have family in Brownsville, Tennessee. So right, it's expanding. So what we need to do is think about how we can have healthy ethnic-race relations where we're not competing for the piece of the pie, but working together to promote an ethnic studies agenda. That's what we ought to be doing. That's why we're here. The university setting is very much different from other settings. But let me tell you, when I was at the Gates Foundation, a lot of the same issues arose. Right? Who has a larger piece of the founding pot to give to organizations? Is it going to be to community-based organizations that deal with African American kids? Latino? And here's the thing, it's always Latino and Black. What about Asian? There's no model minority typology here. There's a lot of need, right? And you know who we always forget? The Native American population. So we keep pushing. Some of us, a few of us that were there, and that's why I say it's important to have people that are trained and are ready to engage in that dialogue at the table. If I weren't at the table at the time for Gates, then certain people wouldn't get funded. Right? So how can we keep pushing for that? And that's why I think, and that's why I'm here, you know, willing to leave the beaches of Southern California, okay, to engage in a new 21st century notion of what it needs to build a world-class education, ethnic studies program that understands variation within, between, but recognizes that the future is the economic vitality of promoting the social mobility of our populations and understanding those unique histories, experiences, and we have a challenge, but I think combined we can come up with a creative plan. That was long.
There are a lot of things you talked about I like so much, but there are two things that I like in particular. That is pragmatic and optimism. In terms of the future, you mentioned quite a few areas to build on to expand our major and master program. Could you talk a little bit more in terms of how optimistic or pragmatic can we get to a master program, especially in terms of faculty, in terms of institutional group?
We have to speak with the administration, right? To be able to create the infrastructure to do so. But I think, some people were talking to me about, well, is this going to be a program that's going to be embedded within, let's say, social sciences or humanities? And I would say, no. I think it ought to be a program that eventually becomes a college. There's only one college of ethnic studies, right? Right? Where is it? Come on. The whole college of ethnic studies.
San Francisco State.
San Francisco State. There's one college of ethnic studies.
God is speaking.
And so, we, again, was it Larry?
Larry.
Yeah, Larry pushing in this direction. We can learn from what they did historically in ethnic studies at San Francisco State. Right? Learn from that, apply what works, and struggle with the rest. But I really think that another model is the Chicano Studies Department at UCSB, right? They were doing good things and created a successful PhD program. Actually, at Berkeley, is ethnic studies its own school? Is it its own school? No, it's only San Francisco State. So I'm optimistic that the end product would be a college named after, Mitt Romney College of or I said something or it went there. But I think that you did a great job of creating the master's program, learning from you, and like what is the next step to create, the major, but then create a master's program. Another idea, I don't know if it's popular here, is an online program which will bring in funds for doctoral students, for junior faculty. But I think that as an optimistic mission would be, I didn't even talk about that because I didn't know how, but that would be the optimism, right, laced with pragmatism. You know that you can do it a little at a time. The same thing when I talked about the prison sustainability. It won't happen overnight, but it's going to happen over time.
Well, first, I really love your talk, and I love the way you frame your entire talk was in this very C. Wright Millsian way, which for those of you who are not sociologists, C. Wright Mills wrote the
Sociological imagination.
Yes, and it involves biography, history, and culture. And I think what you did is created a really compelling, there's my water bottle, anyway, that's fine. But a really compelling idea of how, for you and for everyone who would be a part of this program, those three elements are and as you're like, I really see this great integration. So I have two questions.
So it's always a pat in the back
so
that's very much a sociology.
So one question is, when you were talking about some of the partnerships with communities and using pre-existing institutions, I was wondering if your work connects in any way with Mario Louis Small's work on looking
Bonds
at
and knowledge.
Louis
Small?
yeah, Mario. His first name is Mario. He's at I think he may be at Chicago. He was around a lot.
Oh, Mario Small.
Yeah, yeah. And so he does a lot of work on community centers and schools and places of brokerage. And I was wondering if that would be the first question, is thinking about how that, if your work would connect to that, or how you could see taking part of your work in that direction.
For the answer is yes.
Okay,
very much so.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So the harder question is, so depending on which demographer you most trust, between 2030 and 2050, whites will be a minority in
Right.
Utah. And a big part of that is because of the growth of undocumented residents, and many of us work with undocumented students in higher education, and I'm wondering if you could just brainstorm, what do you see happening for these students? We work with really bright students. If you're undocumented and you make it to college, you're really at the top of your game, and then you
I
graduate.
have a lot of cousins who are in that situation.
So what are your thoughts about how you can bring
Well,
people who
I
are
think that
unauthorized into this?
I'm hoping that by that time things change, right? And then we have some kind of policy agenda to reverse that. But in the meantime, some creative ways that other, particularly community-based organizations, they're raising funds. Because often kids are allowed to go to college, but they have to pay the out-of-state tuition. And that's a lot. I don't know what the out-of-state tuition is in Utah.
We have in-state tuition.
For them.
If you would.
So in the short kind of Band-Aid solution is raise funds so that we can provide scholarships, right? But oftentimes that, it can only work to a certain level. But what we ought to be doing is providing the resources for communities to become involved in that civic process. And I see it a lot in certain areas where community-based organizations are empowering Latinos and other populations to vote, and other populations to vote, with the exception of the past presidential election, which is great, right? But one way is empowering them to vote. And I had my mom the day before election calls me in Spanish, and we went with everything. And what was interesting in California, there were two initiatives called Initiative 30 and 38. And 38 was being promoted by the actor, what's his name, that played Selena's dad. Edward James Olmos. So my mom says, yes, I'm voting for 30. I said, oh, Mom, it's a trick. So part of it is how do we have a reciprocal relationship where we push for a common agenda. And often we're working on ours and understanding. But advocacy is a big component. However, it's so hard for advocacy organizations to get funded. Particularly if you get a grant at a university, you can't do advocacy. So one question is how do you really promote civic knowledge to load and to participate?
We have time left, so if any people
Talk a little bit about transnationalism and ethnic studies. How do you bridge some of those different territories, or at least entirely opposing territories?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into the dates, right? Because they can pigeonhole people into certain camps. But I think that there's this whole notion of is it nationalism or is it ethnicity, right? But I think again it depends on the context. It's transnational based on what we talked about, immigrant youth. Transnational based on immigration and generational differences. It's one of those, I mean, we have colonial issues, we have issues of how capitalism moves from one nation to another because of globalism. But it's not an easy answer. But I think it's one that ought to be, it has always been central to ethnic studies, and particularly to the whole movements of people, right? You have transnationalism. I mean, a lot of the recent work is when folks that come into the U.S. as immigrants, right, and they're sending funds back. We had a whole initiative. It wasn't an initiative, but it was more of a learning at the Gates Foundation about transnationalism and sending money back to your country, right? And how people identify as they go from shifting from one border to another, right? And so they were trying to find a creative way of how do you convert this literature, this understanding, to promote the economic mobility of populations back home. So I guess in a sense I would view it more as a pragmatic view, right, as opposed to more of a theoretical view. Yes?
I wrote down that you talked about RWJF.
Yes.
And I think that it's great that it can really help, reduce disparities in healthcare in the United States. Can you just go into detail about a little bit more about how it works?
Robert Wood Johnson Foundation?
Yeah.
They are the second largest foundation in the world in grant making, with like a $16 billion endowment. And they have different areas. One is human capital. Another is health disparities, and I forgot what the third is. But they really want to push to create the new generation of health providers that represent what folks look like, right, in the U.S. And so there's huge grant making that deals with health disparities around research, health disparities in practice, and health disparities in policy. So they're online, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they're the Johnson & Johnson family. You guys remember that?
Karen.
I appreciate your presentations. Thank you for coming. I am interested in the idea of diaspora, the black diaspora, and having a vision for our studies to not only just focus on African Americans, but also focus on black diaspora. What is your perspective?
Well, I think it's, we ought to think this. You have immigrants coming in, you have mixed race coming in from other countries, like black Cubans, black Dominicans, And I think that's a unique history and experience that ought to be taught. One of the issues right now in education is that you have a lot of the immigrant populations, let's say the East Coast. And so they're distancing themselves from the African American experience because they don't want to be judged in that way, right? So I think that, again, like we studied the Latino population and understanding that it's not homogenous, in the same way that we have to look at that and how the immigration shifts, constantly changes what we mean by black, right? And a lot of the same issues persist: skin color, right? Geography, nation state.
Any additional questions? Okay, before we thank Dr. Conchas, we have evaluations, Janet. It has them in the back of the room, so we would appreciate if you can take one, make sure we get it. If you can fill it out here, great. If you can't, you can, how you would like to.
Email me or scan it, email me or send it through interoffice mail, Seawall 112.
And her email address is janet.opal@utah.edu. So let's give Dr.
Thank you.
Conchas